There is global condemnation of the US airstrikes on Venezuela. China has hit out at the US for blatant use of force against a sovereign nation and action against President Maduro. Beijing has said such hegemonic acts violate international law and threaten peace and security in the region. Let me take this to Edward, who continues to stay with us on the broadcast. Edward, of course, the US has thought this through and through. But fact still remains that Russia, China are condemning these strikes. And while the US has said that there will be no further escalation from their side, the operation is done, it is successful. But in a scenario that there is retaliation, how do you see it unfold?
Well, I mean, China has some degree of legitimacy in speaking to the United States in that way because it hasn't actually itself conducted any military operations in the world. Russia has absolutely zero legitimacy in condemning the United States in Venezuela because, of course, it's entering the fourth or fifth year of a war over in Ukraine. So there's absolutely no way that Russia should be telling the United States anything about foreign policy. How I see this unfurling is, of course, that there are great challenges now for Venezuela and for Venezuelan society. It's very, very difficult, as history shows, to recover an economy and a society on the basis of a post-communist reconstruction. So I would say that it's probably only fitting and fair that just as the United States has planned this operation and conducted it very well, that there be some sort of support, both fiscal and political, for any government in Venezuela that replaces Maduro. And I think that the United States probably is planning to do that. And I hope that the Venezuelan people now will enter a period of democratic flourishing, frankly.
All right, Sandeep, I'd like to bring you in, especially to understand what the implications from here on will be, especially given the fact that Maduro is captured, foreign head of state to be brought to the US courts for trial. How might this impact international norms, given the fact that the US is constantly saying that Maduro had really unlawfully extended his term and he was not the right man to lead Venezuela. He has been charged with narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, and it was only fair that he be brought to the US to face the law.
Well, absolutely, Ashish, and we're going to see a lot of this debate in the next couple of days about the legality of an operation like this, where you kidnap, literally, this is a word for it. This, you kidnapped another president and you brought him back for trial. He's of course been declared, a drug trafficker. All his close associates, including his wife, incidentally, have been, named as drug traffickers. That is one way for President Trump to bypass going to Congress. This is, if you can call it that, this is President Trump's own special military operation of the kind that President Putin launched in Ukraine. This is to bypass a lot of those other things of, things of going to Congress and getting approval for a normal invasion of Venezuela, or the kind that you would have to do as was done in the past with Iraq, for instance. So this kind of bypassed that, and they've made the case against Maduro, the entire operation, the blockade, the attacks on all the narco traffickers, the boats, the destruction of all the boats, where literally more than 100 people have been killed so far in the last couple of months, have all been part of this a case that has been built up against Maduro, the fact that he was running a drug cartel out of Venezuela, and he was therefore responsible for narco trafficking into the United States. That's the case that the U.S. has made out against Maduro, and which is why he's been brought back to stand for trial. And this is history, as they say, doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And again, going back to what happened with Manuel Noriega, another a Latin American dictator, in 1989. He was captured and brought to the United States, where he stood trial on various charges, including drug trafficking. And in this case, also, it seems to be the same, that Maduro will possibly spend the rest of his life in a US prison, he and his wife, unless they can, cut some kind of a deal, a bargain, or something like that. But for the moment, it appears that the US military action seems to be restricted to Maduro. It's a big downsizing of the objectives of changing the regime in Venezuela. We don't know what kind of deal was struck with possibly the surviving regime members there in Venezuela, whether Maduro was actually sacrificed by members of his own cabinet, by members of his own government. He was sold out. There was a very lucrative, prize kept on his head, so something like more than $50 million. So one really doesn't know the kind of, backroom dealings that went on in this case. But you can look at past precedent. There have been cases like Assad, for instance, Bashar al-Assad in Syria. There was a deal that was cut which allowed him to retreat to Moscow in safety, and Syria was handed over to another regime, the HTS, led by Jolani. So it's quite possible that you might see something very similar unfolding in Venezuela. While the trial continues in the US, it's going to be a very high visibility trial. The full force of the US, the DEA is going to come into play, and they're going to charge President Maduro for all of those, provisions of the drug act that he's being charged with, including drug trafficking, cocaine smuggling into the United States. Though there is to be fair, there is very little evidence of Venezuela actually sending drugs into the United States. It is either a transit point, or the fact is that it is the Colombia and Mexico that actually pump in the maximum number of drugs into the United States. But why let facts like that come in the way of an interesting story? And that story is the trial of President Maduro in the United States.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And again, waiting for that news briefing to begin and what Trump has to say on these strikes. I request both you gentlemen to stay on.